Okay, so we all set?
Yes, thank you, Kerrie.
All right. Well, you may not realise that the connection between rockets and stamps is actually much older than the space race. It goes back to 1928 when an Austrian rocket pioneer decided he'd try to develop a means of sending mail across the, the deep valleys of Switzerland. And to pay for his research, he started flying postcards in his rockets that he'd put extra little stickers and stamps that he made himself on the cards and charge people for them. And then they would become quite collectible. And in fact, by the 1930s, the idea of rocket mail had reached an extent that here, for example, in Popular Mechanics in 1934, they're looking at the potential future of mail being delivered by rocket. And through the 30s, you had a lot of mail rocket experimenters around the world. Here in Australia, for example, we actually had the Australian Rocket Society with their wonderful Heath Robinson sort of rocket there, the Zodiac. Which conveniently blew up a couple of times. In the US, they experimented with rocket-powered planes to deliver the mail. This is the Gloria, the first American rocket plane, which carried a number of envelopes on it with special rocket mail stickers and stampings on it. And interestingly, it was Cuba that issued the first official rocket mail stamp, and that was in 1939. And you can see the Cuban government overprinted one of their regular stamps with experimental rocket posts. So they were really keen on it. And you can see this wonderful stamping, like rubber stamping image on the envelope there as well. And these are all things that play into some of what we're going to see during the Cold War, because they set a pattern, if you like, for future rocket mail or airmail related materials. Now, after the war, there was a great deal of interest in the idea of rocket mail. This is a 1955 story that revolved around the idea of rocket mail coming from the UK to Australia and landing at Woomera in 1957. This was Mechanics Illustrated, I think it was, that again showing us what our future 1965 rocket mail would be. The Americans actually began experimenting with real rocket mail using missiles from launched from a submarine. This is in 1959. And some of you may remember or have heard about the Rocket Man. So at the Easter show in 1964 and 65 here in Australia, we had what was his name? Rob Quarter, who was one of the Bell rocket jet built pilots. And in his very first visit, he actually delivered mail that was brought to the Easter show. He collected it from the postman and flew it across the arena and delivered it to Prime Minister Menzies. So this was the first rocket built mail in Australia. I think it might have been the first rocket built mail in the world. So the ideas connecting rockets and mail were around for a while. But the very first stamp that actually depicted a rocket was an American stamp from 1948 for the centenary of Fort Bliss. Now, you're probably not familiar with Fort Bliss, but it was actually the US base that managed what we now know as the White Sands Missile Range. And in 1948, they were hosting the German team from Peenemünde, who had been brought over to the United States. This is von Braun and his colleagues. And of course, they were testing a number of captured V2s there. And so you see the V2 depicted on the stamp as symbolic of the future of Fort Bliss and its work in the missile area compared to its past as a pioneering location. And of course, at the same time that these kinds of experiments were going on in the US, they were also going on in Russia, but of course under great secrecy. We had no idea that the Soviets were launching their captured V2s at the Kapustin Yar. Interestingly, while that was happening in the Soviet Union, their first space-related stamp was issued in 1951 showing Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Now, I hope you know his name, and if you don't, shame on you. Tsiolkovsky was one of the great early pioneers of astronautics, and very famous in the Soviet Union for essentially being the father of rocketry and the father of astronautical science in the Soviet Union. And he was featured on a series of stamps that depicted 16 different scientists. So even though the Russians were working on their missile technology very much in secret, they wanted to give a hint that, you know, the Soviet Union actually had a very strong history with the, you know, this very important pioneer of rocketry. And it's during the 50s that we really start to see this interest in spaceflight, in the possibility that satellites would soon occur, that people traveling into space would happen relatively soon. So from around about 52, you start to see things like the articles by Werner von Braun and many of his colleagues in the Collier's magazine, Time magazine here featuring the future robotic space pioneer. Even in Russia, they had the Technology magazine. This is a 1953 edition showing an image of a Soviet moon base. And one of the things you'll notice there is lots of red stars decorating everything. The Soviets were very good at making sure there was some communist symbol in in all kinds of illustrations, however otherwise unrelated to communism itself they were. But this whole idea of the potential of getting into space was so prominent at this time that you had things like Italy actually issuing an official stamp for the International Astronautical Congress that was held in Rome in 1956. And just for those of you who don't know yet, the next International Astronautical Congress, or next year's one, will be held in Sydney. So you might want to think about whether you might like to come along at least to one of the free public days that they'll have. And a lot of the interest in space at this time, and what actually drove the beginnings of the space age, was the International Geophysical Year. Now, this was a global year of the scientific study of the Earth and its relation to the space environment. Now, it was first proposed in around 1951. By 1954, the developments in rocketry had reached a point where there was a reasonable possibility that satellites could be launched. And so the proposal to launch a satellite during the International Geophysical Year became part of their program. And that's why the logo of the IGY actually has this satellite in orbit around the Earth. So in 1955, the United States and the Soviet Union both announced that they would launch or attempt to launch a satellite during the International Geophysical Year. Of course, in the West, everybody thought the Russians were just doing a Me Too to the United States announcement, so it wasn't given the sort of credence it should have been. The Soviets, however, were very serious about the International Geophysical Year and the idea of launching a satellite. And when the SAGY, which is this CSAGY, that was the governing body of the Geophysical Year, met in Moscow, they made a big thing about it. Here's a particular, one of the envelopes that they released for it, a first day cover, which has a lot of these pictorial postmarks that we're going to see a lot of in my talk here, with symbols of communism. There's the Kremlin and so on, and very much this promotion of Soviet involvement in space. Now, as I mentioned, in the Western world, we really thought the United States would be launching the world's first satellite. This is a cover of Life magazine just before, in 57, not long before the IGY was due to start. This is a satellite that was called Vanguard. Now, the satellite development went very well. The development of the rocket did not go so well, and they're having a lot of trouble getting a successful launch. And as a result of that, it was actually, of course, the Soviet Union that launched the world's first satellite. And in fact, it's interesting that the Russians initially, while they referred to it as a history-making achievement, really didn't understand how the West was going to react. And so this is actually the announcement here. Where are we at? So this is the announcement on the front page of Pravda, the communist newspaper. But as you can see, it's a relatively small announcement. It's not the banner headline. It's just a small announcement saying that the Soviet Union had launched, the world's first satellite. But over in the West, everybody went berserk. The fact that the Soviet Union had managed to launch a satellite ahead of the United States, people had already been talking about a space race between the US and the USSR. And you can see some of the headlines here. This is a selection of British ones. Russia wins the race into space. Red moon over London, very much tying into that communist, this isn't Reds under the bed, this is Reds in orbit above us. So there's a lot of concern in the West about this. Even here in Australia, Soviets beat the world in the moon race. So, there was a lot of concern in the West about what this meant. Did the Russians now have the capability to, bomb the crap out of the West with the nuclear weapons that they had by this time? What was Sputnik doing up there? So huge consternation in the West. Initially, somewhere like the New York Times had a fairly restrained coverage, but you'll notice that you may or may not be able to read that very clearly, but it says device is 8 times heavier than the one planned by the US. And this is a thing that the Russians were soon going to make great play of, is that Sputnik at 83.5 kilograms actually weighed more than the combined mass of the first 2 American satellites, Explorer 1 and Vanguard, when they finally launched it. So there was a lot of consternation in the US that America had been asleep at the wheel, as it were, and that the Soviets had overtaken the West in science and technology. And so this was, this was felt that we were falling behind, and that America and the Western world generally had to really work to catch up. And at this point, the Russians suddenly realized that the West is freaking out. We now have a propaganda gold mine, that, we can use this concern in the West to say the communist system is the best because it has produced the science and technology that put the first satellite into orbit. And this is very much what part of what the space race became. It was a bit of a mine's better than yours. Very much my political system is better than your political system because my space technology is better than your space technology. Whichever country gets the first is showing that their space technology is better than the other side. And so on October the 6th, you've got these 2 breathless headlines in Pravda. You've got this, first in the world satellite in orbit, and particularly this triumph of Soviet science and technology. And we're going to see that turn up again and again. This is the junior version of Pravda. This is Komsomolskaya Pravda, particularly targeted at teenagers and young people. And, it's saying that the very first satellite in the world is ours. It's Soviet. So they're really starting to get excited. Now, the Russians, of course, because the program had been kept totally secret up to that point, that they hadn't immediately planned anything like producing stamps to commemorate it. But by sheer fluke, 2 stamps came out within the few weeks after the launch of Sputnik 1. There was an International Geophysical Year stamp which depicted a rocket, but in fact it was meant to be a sounding rocket. And in fact, they issued another one, similar one in 1959, depicting a sounding rocket, because sounding rockets were another part of the International Geophysical Year. But they also released one commemorating Tsiolkovsky because it was the 100th anniversary of his birth. So that was very convenient. And here we can actually see one of these Tsiolkovsky stamps with an overprint that, again, 4th of the 10th, 57, first in space, satellite of the Earth. So the Russians were starting to make propaganda hay out of using their stamps. And it was actually at the end of December in 57 that they issued the first official space stamp. And here you can see, you can see that it's the actual shape that we know of Sputnik 1. Again, first in the world, Soviets satellite in space. And in fact, they also, along with that, issued the first of the space covers. This is one, and you can see they've depicted a rocket on it, but of course it doesn't look anything like a real rocket. This is one of the things the Soviets were very careful about. We don't want the West to really know what our technology is like. So virtually all the rockets you see in early space covers or space stamps, and this is a 1961 stamp. When they revalued all the Soviet currency, they had to issue a new set of stamps. So this is one of the revalued stamps they issued. And this is supposed to be Sputnik, although it looks a bit science fiction-y to me. And then you've got this rocket that is totally science fiction-y. But the idea is to symbolize, Russia's, hail achievements in science and technology sort of thing. But we don't really want to tell you what our science and technology looks like. Of course, a lot of the Warsaw Pact countries issued stamps commemorating the launch of Sputnik 1. This is, East Germany, Poland, and North Korea. And of course, many of the other Soviet allied or satellite states did as well. And that means, of course, that the Soviet Union could get a double whammy with its stamp propaganda, because you had other countries that were also issuing stamps commemorating the event, and those were going out in different ways into the Western world as well as for domestic propaganda. And in fact, the Soviets kept, reusing Sputnik as an image and an achievement to reinforce both at home and to the international audiences that they were first. So, for the 5th anniversary, there was a special stamp issued with a special first day cover. And this is a lovely example. It's got, a hammer and sickle design on it. It's got this wonderful extra postmark that commemorates that 5th anniversary, again, with a nice red star on the Sputnik, another imprint on the stamp, which again has Sputnik and the hammer and sickle, and again, more of these statements about how wonderful Soviet science and technology is, we're the country that's led the way into space, this sort of thing. And you're still seeing it. This is the 10th anniversary and the 15th anniversary. This one, as you can see, is actually a lot more restrained. By the early 70s, the Soviets are toning down a lot of this quite extreme rhetoric that we see in the early space stamps and space covers. And a lot of this, of course, comes from, this is the period when, Khrushchev was doing things like hammering his shoe on the desk at the United Nations and threatening to bury the West and turn out missiles like sausages and all this kind of thing. So it's very much drawn from the kind of bombast that we see from Khrushchev and the party leadership in this period. So when Sputnik 2 was launched, the Soviets were sort of a little more ready, and they produced very quickly afterwards this lovely set of stamps, which is actually based around a statue that's an allegory of being able to reach into space, which is called To the Stars. And it depicts Mother Russia, in this instance, throwing Sputnik into the sky. So she's throwing the satellite into space. And of course, in the background, we've got the nice red star on top of the Kremlin, symbolizing the power of the communist system. The first day cover that was issued has this pictorial postmark, which again, this is actually quite an interesting one, because the first day cover was issued for Sputnik 2, but this particular one has a postmark that's actually saying 2,000 orbits of Sputnik 2. So they're making a big thing about the fact that it's been in orbit for that long. And this is at the end of March 58, at which time America had only just got 2 satellites into orbit. And of course, none of them had obviously been in orbit for that long. Of course, before the end of 57, they'd already launched the second satellite, Sputnik 2, which of course carried Laika, the dog. And again, you can see, Romania's showing, the victory, the laurel wreath of victory. There's a nice Soviet star here. Again, we're seeing the Kremlin appearing with the red star on top. All of this keeps reinforcing this idea that, you know, Soviet technology or the Soviet system is producing this wonderful space technology. Interestingly, of course, we get a pretty good description in this Romanian stamp of what Sputnik 2 looked like. And not a bad one here in this Czech stamp either. But the rocket, of course, bears no relationship to what the actual Soviet missiles or rockets of the time looked like. When Sputnik 3 finally came along, they were really getting into their stride with getting all the rhetoric together. So we've got the satellite here, you know, the Soviet satellite of the Earth. We've got this statement here about not only has, you know, the Soviet Union produced this great research technology, but look, it weighs 1,327 kilograms. And it's already made, you know, 1,880 orbits or kilometers around the Earth in its orbits at the time that this stamp was released. You know, the Romanian stamp is doing the same thing. Look at the weight of this thing. It's so much bigger than anything the United States has launched at this time. And it was certainly quite a capable satellite compared to Sputnik 1 or Sputnik 2, but it still didn't actually return the same level of scientific data that we were getting out of, at this point in time, Explorer 1 and Vanguard 1. But, you know, the Russians made a big thing about the weight. What they didn't want to tell us was that their rockets could lift these huge weights because their nuclear weapons were so clunky and large. They had to have bigger rockets than the Americans to lift, bigger missiles to lift their much bigger nuclear weapons, because they didn't have the miniaturization technologies that the United States had. And in fact, that's the interesting thing. America had a hard time launching really big satellites because they didn't have launchers big enough, because they didn't need them. They didn't need their missiles to be to have as much thrust as those from the Soviet Union. So again, you've got you know, this development of covers now that are starting to have these nice pictorial images, which are again building on several different what's the word, propaganda tropes into the imagery. That we're starting to see these more elaborate pictorial postmarks as well. This one I rather love. This is a postcard that focuses on Laika, but it's got the three, so Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, Sputnik 3. So it's sort of saying again, you know, look what we've done as part of the International Geophysical Year. We've achieved these firsts, first satellite, first animal, heaviest satellite. You know, so rub that in your face, West. This was very much this way they approach things. Sputnik 3 actually started up another trend. Postcards are a big thing in the Soviet Union. And during the USSR, which of course was officially atheist, they had these special postcards for New Year, which effectively became Christmas. So you begin to see, and this is obviously Sputnik 3 postcard for the New Year. These ones were all aimed at kids, but they've all got space themes designed to help the, you know, sort of get the kids know, look at the Soviet Union is producing this wonderful technology for you, and associating it with, you know, the good fun that they had at New Year. So we've got Sputnik 3, we've got Lunar, or sometimes called Lunik 2 in the West, getting the first spacecraft, even though it crashed onto the moon, but getting the first spacecraft onto the lunar surface. The Vostok, so the first Soviet manned spacecraft. And this is just another set from the late 60s, early 70s as well. So the tradition went on for some time to use space themes as part of getting the kids to be aware of the achievements of Soviet science and technology. And in fact, we even see here, we've got another poster, propaganda poster, that essentially is saying, you know, from making models to making spaceships. So in other words, encouraging young people to go into science and technology studies, not just make models, but actually go on. Now in the Soviet Union, you can be making spaceships in the future. So they were very much using space as a way of encouraging young people to understand what's the word I want here, the achievements of the Soviet Union and how wonderful communism was, but also encouraging them to look towards science and technology for their future careers. With the first lunar missions, so Luna 1, 2, and 3, which essentially had the first lunar flyby, the first crash landing onto the moon, and then providing us with the first images of the lunar far side. They actually went for something that was rather more realistic in terms of depicting the trajectories from the Earth to the moon. And actually realistically, although again, the rockets are always depicted incorrectly, but reasonably realistically depicting some of the spacecraft, particularly Luna 3 here. And this one is rather nice because Luna 3, of course, gave us the first image of the lunar far side. So, here's that map that was created from that early image. So again, the Soviet Union has given us this first view of the moon. And again, the same kind of thing, you've got countries like China and in this case, Hungary, which are issuing stamps to commemorate these events as well. What is interesting is this is, I think, the first time that we see the West reacting in a sense by giving a Soviet space mission coverage on Time magazine. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Time shortly, but this one is marking the Luna 3, giving us that first view of the far side of the moon. So America, in a sense, reacted to the propaganda in different ways, but not ignoring the fact that the Soviet Union was making these space achievements. And the Soviet Union, again, was sort of looking at the fact that the West was seeing this material as well as their own people internally. So, you get, these more and more elaborate covers, which are going to come to their real peak during the early part of the human spaceflight program. But at the same time, the Russians have always had a big thing in propaganda posters. So although they're not philatelic, they're very much related, and you see a lot of similar imagery in the posters as you see on the stamps and postcards and so on. And so we start to see a lot of space propaganda posters that draw on tropes you see in other types of Soviet propaganda imagery. So here we've got Mother Russia. This goes right back to World War II, this image of Mother Russia. And she's, she sent the spaceship on the way to the moon. And this was the pennant, the Soviet pennant that Luna 2 landed on the moon. Here we've got one praising, scientific and technical workers who, of course, together have created the rockets that are going to the moon. This one I really love. We've got for our peace and progress. So we've got Sputnik 1, 2, 3, this spacecraft, which generally is meant to represent human space flight. We've got the pennant on the moon. We've got this rocket up here, which actually is going to Venus. And, we've got the triumphant worker holding the symbols of the Soviet Union, the hammer and sickle and the laurel of victory. So very much saying, the Soviet Union is triumphant. This one I love too. It says, we were born to make the dream come true. That is the dream of spaceflight. And interestingly, of course, the very fact that space had such power, particularly to frighten the West in a sense, meant that the Soviets were quite happy to, what can we call it, adopt it to help promote other causes into the propaganda of other areas. So here, for example, disarmament was a big thing in the early 60s. And the Soviets were always going on about atoms for peace and not atom bombs. And so here, this was a stamp issued for the World Disarmament Conference in 1958. So, they're saying, no atom bombs, but we can use atoms peacefully. Here's nuclear power stations. We've got the nuclear powered icebreaker Lenin. And of course, our technology has also given us this wonderful space technology. And they use the same thing again here, which is let's have peace. So in other words, cross out the bombs and we'll use the atoms to make rockets and, and nuclear powered ships and things. So again, they keep, adopting space to help promote other causes. Now, I said before, I just mentioned time briefly. In the West, of course, we don't have that same, certainly in the United States, they didn't have that same florid propaganda poster culture that they have in the Soviet Union. But you could almost say that magazines like Time were the equivalent. And so I like to look at the covers of Time and how they approach promoting US space achievements. Now, so sort of these were the equivalents in a sense of some of the early propaganda posters we've just looked at. So here they're talking about the missile and the future of the missile. When the United States actually gets its first satellite in orbit, here we have von Braun. When Vanguard gives us the data that enables us to discover the Van Allen radiation belts, we see Van Allen and his instruments highlighted there. In 1960, when the United States begins to launch its first application satellite, so we had the first weather satellite, the first navigation satellite, first communication satellites, we're seeing them depicted here as well. But in each case, it's a much more laid back depiction, you know, a very, very straightforward depiction. You know, this is the person, this is what they've done, or this is the thing that's happening, without all the nationalistic bombast that you see in the Soviet propaganda posters. So, you know, there's not a US flag to be seen anywhere here. There's no, you know, there's no American eagles. It's a statement of achievement, but without a lot of that background propaganda that we see in the Soviet posters and stamps. And this is something that carries through to the very first American space stamp. So this is the first time, you know, by this point, the Russians have issued dozens of space stamps. Every sort of thing they've even thought about with space has now been on a stamp. But this is the first time that the United States in 1960 has actually issued a stamp. And this is for the launch of Echo 1, which of course was the first passive reflector communication satellite. Now, they did take a little dig at the Russians in the sense of putting this tag on it, you know, communications for peace, which is very much turning back that Russian peace imagery. But again, more or less a simple statement of fact. We've put a satellite in orbit that you can communicate around the world with. Even the first day covers, they're much simpler in design. Again, you know, you don't see any overt nationalist symbolism. You know, obviously you see the NASA logo because these are things NASA's involved with, but they're very straightforward. And, you know, they're just saying, right, this is the world's first communication satellite placed in orbit around the Earth. So although, you know, they're saying proudly that we're doing these things, they're not approaching it with that same level of bombast. So compare, for example, these were some of the first Soviet communication satellites, the Molniya satellites, and you can see these are the first couple of stamps that were issued for those. You know, we've got inevitably the Kremlin with a red star. We've got the space flight monument that had been built in Moscow by this time. We're showing the satellite in orbit, you know, and how it's sending television. So, you know, they're making a lot more of the achievement in a sense. They're not quite as, they're not quite as florid as some of the earlier ones, but they're certainly still got the communist symbols in them. You see here we've got the red star in Moscow again. And I threw in, I just thought it was interesting that in fact Australia's first space stamps are also relatively simple, but they're also specifically targeted at applications. So our first, in fact, our first space stamp was the World Telecommunications one, which marked the first use of Australia being connected to the world with the Intelsat satellites. That was in, that stamp actually came out in 1967. And then in 1968, we had the two World Weather Watch stamps, which are actually showing how Australia uses weather satellites to, you know, give us that data that we need for understanding Australia's weather. But again, they're very simple, straightforward, effectively just saying Australia uses these technologies. They're not saying we invented them or anything like that. So they're an interesting contrast to, you know, a lot of the other early space stamps that we see. Now, in the US, they established their first astronaut corps in 1959. The Soviets, of course, were being very secretive about their planned human spaceflight program, and the Americans, very deliberately as contrast, conducted their program in full public view, as it were. And so they wanted to depict the astronauts not as military officers, so we usually see them in magazines like Life. In many of the photos that depict them and their families, we don't see them mostly in military uniform. We usually see them in civilian clothes. This was part of NASA's particular emphasis on the fact that it was a civilian agency, even though their astronauts had to be military men. And there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that they were good Americans, they were married, they had families, they were, you know, wholesome people, you know, unlike those unknown, possibly nasty, evil Russians who might be their future cosmonauts. But at the same time, there was the other side of the story, which is they were going to be our knights in shining armor, going to battle the space race against the Soviet Union. And so we do see a lot of these kinds of images that are heroic in, you know, with the astronauts in their spacesuits, ready to ultimately go and do battle for the West against the communist nations, if necessary, in the space race. Back in the Soviet Union, they weren't admitting to having a manned spaceflight program, so they did make an interesting thing about their first programs where they were able to successfully fly and recover dogs into orbit during the testing of the Vostok spacecraft. So here, for example, we've got the first stamps marking the return of Belka and Strelka, the first dogs successfully returned from space. You know, again, we've got the good old Kremlin, the Red Star, another one of these rockets that we can't actually figure out what it really looks like. And lots of nice Soviet technology here, a nice antenna that is being used to control the spacecraft. Here again with Zvezdochka in 61 that flew just before Gagarin's flight, you know, being remotely controlled from the Earth. So we can see that they have these technologies, but they don't want us to know too much about what they actually look like, what the level of technology is. And I rather love this. This is another poster, you know, where we've got the heroic worker who's created the space vehicle in which Belka and Strelka flew. And it says, you know, the way is now open for humans. So the dogs have led the way for us. Now, meanwhile, over in the United States, Life magazine actually featured on the cover the first two, and this is before the astronaut program in the US was actually revealed. This is Abel and Baker, the two first space monkeys that returned successfully from space. So they took the headlines ahead of the astronauts. But generally speaking, the space animals in the US didn't get the same level of coverage, rather interestingly, that the space dogs got in the Soviet Union. They were hugely popular. But of course, when the Soviet Union beat the Americans again to getting the first person in space, they went absolutely into overdrive with the propaganda. So this is the set of 4 stamps that were issued specifically to commemorate Gagarin's flight. What it's saying here is, you know, a man from the Soviet lands in space. So, you know, hail Soviet science and technology. You know, Sputnik 1, rockets to the moon. Now we've got human space flight. You know, Kremlin, Red Star, technology here in the background. So they're really laying it on in this set of stamps. We've got Gagarin as a hero. He's hero of the Soviet Union medal. The victors, you know, shut up and get my tongue around it. The branch of peace, but also symbolizing the victors' laurel wreath. You know, again, here's this, you know, heroic Gagarin flying into space for the communist system. And a comment or part of a statement from Khrushchev talking about how the Soviet Union, led the world into socialism, and now Soviet science and technology is leading the world into space. Again, we've got this as a poster that was put up in around a lot of parts of, Moscow and other places in the Soviet Union, saying, hail to the party. And this, I rather love, this is a picture of one of these posters actually up somewhere on a street in Moscow, and the two ladies, probably grandmothers, from their scarves they've got wrapped around their head, looking at this poster of Gagarin, and again, this reinforced idea of the party and socialism being responsible for the achievements of Soviet spaceflight. And we see quite a lot of that in the posters. There was a special stamp issued for the 22nd conference of the Soviet Union, of the Communist Party. It says, hail to the CPSS, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Again, hail to our Soviet system, as it were. And here we've got, different space achievements that are all due to how wonderful the Communist Party of the Soviet Union is. So this is Vostok 1 through 4. We've got this one slightly earlier. It says, our triumph in the cosmos is our hymn to the Soviet lands. And I like this one because it not only sort of says, we've got humans into space, we're carrying the hammer and sickle out into the cosmos, but it also implies we not only have rockets, we have honking great missiles that we can use to bomb you if necessary. This one, which is saying, the October, as in the October Revolution, opens the path into space. The heroes of the October Revolution, and were the pioneers of space, because without them we wouldn't have had the technology that we have. Lenin, in the name of Lenin, is leading us forward into space. Socialism gave us the start into space. And this particular, this one I really love. This is the road to the stars is sort of open through the Soviet system. Hail to the Soviet system. And here we've got this wonderfully vigorous cosmonaut holding up his hammer and sickle, and the Vostok spacecraft listed here as the red stars. So this enormous reinforcement of the link between socialism, or the communist system, and how the Soviet Union was able to develop its space technology. When Gagarin returned from space, again, they were ready this time with Pravda. So we've got, here he is, a hail to our returning heroes sort of thing. These are the covers of the first couple of days after, in fact, the 12th of April. So this is when Gagarin's flight is first announced and his safe return. And then when he's back in Moscow and, being feted by Khrushchev. So, almost everything on this page is about how wonderful Soviet science and technology is and what a hero Gagarin is and so forth. And I'm not being facetious here to denigrate Gagarin, but this was very much this kind of way they were portraying it. Whereas, again, the contrast in the West, it's being reported, and saying, great, man's in orbit, he's come back, he feels well. But this is the one I really love from the Huntsville Times, man into space, that's great. But over here, so close and yet so far, sighs the Cape, because they were almost ready to launch Alan Shepard at that time, and the launch had been delayed for a couple of weeks. And so, had they launched earlier when they'd originally planned, Shepard would have in fact been the first person in space. So, they were definitely a bit disappointed in that regard. But again, you've got all these first day covers with these wonderful images, the Soviet man with his hand heading out, as a pioneer towards the stars, great pictorial postmark, which is using this man from the Soviet lands in space, very much a tagline that gets repeated again and again through this period. This is interesting. This is actually a record of Gagarin's conversations from space that was released, which is fairly, remembering in these days, there was no, especially in the Soviet Union, people didn't have home recording equipment or anything like that. But and they did this in America too. They actually released these recordings of the conversations between the astronauts and the ground. So that's a rather interesting thing. A lot of other nations as well, you know, again, the aligned communist nations were releasing similar postcards. This is a Czechoslovakian one with a Czech stamp that also commemorates the launch, and you'll see it's got a dove of peace there to indicate, you know, we're going to space for peaceful purposes. But if you look at the design of the rocket there, you'll see it's this sort of strangely amorphous design that shows you no detail, and it's clearly been inspired by, this was the picture that the Russians released, that the Soviet Union officially released of the launch. And when I was a little kid, I actually thought, oh, it looks like they're launching a giant seed, because of course what they were doing is deliberately disguising the shape of the rocket. And they would do this quite a lot. You'd see a lot of these doctored photos that, and you'd see this one still being repeated in Western books about the history of space for many years, because we didn't have anything better that actually showed Gagarin's launch. There was very much this secrecy about the technology. This one's interesting. This is probably the least elaborate postcard I've ever seen for Gagarin. They all get more and more full of different propaganda elements from there. And by contrast, of course, going back to Time, or in fact, in the US, you know, Life and Time both covered Gagarin's flight, but of course in a much more restrained way, and you get the same approach to the launch of the first American astronauts. So Shepard, Glenn, you know, we see Shepard a bit more perhaps as the knight in shining armor, but Glenn being the smiling spaceman, the kindly face of America in orbit. Gordon Cooper, the first American to spend a day in space. So again, they're sort of making very simple, what I call quiet, what I think of as quiet achiever statements. So, you know, America is doing these things, but we're not making a huge fuss about it. We're just getting on and doing it. And even the first Mercury stamp that you see here, I love this because it's so, again, so very simple. It just says, you know, Project Mercury, US man in space. No, you know, no American flags, no truth, justice, and the American way or anything like that. It's just saying America has put a man in space. You know, we're doing something as a quiet achiever. Interestingly, with this stamp, the stamps were printed before Glenn's first flight, but they were sent out to all the post offices, but they weren't released until he was safely back on the ground. Now, had Glenn's flight failed in some way, you know, had he died in orbit or re-entry, none of those stamps would have been released. They would have been recalled and held until the next time America tried to launch someone into space, and then they would have been readied again for release. So, of course, they don't have any dates or anything like that on them, which is quite interesting. Again, you know, these kinds of covers, they're very simple, straightforward. You know, the mission of Project Mercury was to get an astronaut to the edge of space. John Glenn, first American successfully in orbit. You know, there was a certain element of, we can't crow too much because we haven't done these things first. But at the same time, there's that, you know, we're quietly going about our business, achieving the things that we said we would do. And I particularly like this one, even though it's relatively simple, because it's showing us what America's rockets look like. So it's, again, it's saying in this backhanded way, unlike the Russians who keep concealing what their rockets look like, we're quite open to show you what our rockets and missiles look like. So again, they're sort of playing off that secrecy of the Soviet Union and that fear of what are the communists really doing undercover. Interestingly, Gagarin's launch, and of course the huge propaganda victory that followed it, encouraged the Russians to actually create a commemorative day. It's Cosmonauts Day, which of course is the day we're about to celebrate as now as Yuri's night. It became an event from 1962, and from that point, and they still celebrate Cosmonauts Day, or I think it's called Cosmonautics Day today. but back in the, particularly in the 60s and 70s, there would be a special stamp released every year. So this is 62, 63, 64, the 65 ones. You'll notice Tsiolkovsky gets quite a lot of credit here. He appears on the 64 stamp. He turns up again on the 265 stamps. Here he is as the person behind the success of the Vostok program, in the sense again of being that spaceflight pioneer. And of course, this is the the heroic worker who, of course, is behind the technical success of Sputnik 1. This is really interesting. For 66, we had the marking the Luna 9 landing on the moon, which was the first successful soft landing on the moon. And 67, which is interesting, this is 2 years, of course, after Leonov successfully made the world's first spacewalk. But what they've done here is take actual artwork that Leonov made. He actually made a number of sketches in space and then completed the artworks when he came back to Earth. And so they've actually taken his artworks and used them as the basis for the stamps here. And then by 68, again, they're sort of commemorating some of our great steps of the past few years. So we've got Leonov, of course, the getting things onto the moon. We've got the first docking of 2 unmanned spacecraft, and Venera 4, which of course was the first successful Soviet mission to Venus. So, and this would go on year after year. These stamps would be commemorating some major space events and maybe some major anniversaries that were occurring. They don't issue them every year now, but I think right up to the fall of the Soviet Union, they were regularly issuing Cosmonauts Day stamps. Ew. It went a bit faster than I wanted it to. For the rest of the Vostok program, a little more restrained, especially once Khrushchev was removed from power. You see a bit more of a drawback from a lot of the really heavy, bombastic Soviet imagery. But even in this period, we've got so Vostok 2, Vostok 3, 4. Again, we've got, Hail the Space Twins or the Cosmic Twins. Another manned space flight or manned Sputnik. Then we've got the Vostok 5 and 6, which of course Tereshkova became the first woman in space. The Soviets made a bit more of a thing of her, of course, because she was designed to prove that in the Soviet system, men and women were equal. That so a woman could be a cosmonaut just as much as a man, even though, in fact, Tereshkova was the only woman who ever flew in that early program. So she got her own stamp as well. So not just a joint one with the Vostok 5-6 joint mission. She and Gagarin were, of course, regularly paired together into public relations appearances, propaganda appearances. And I love this as the cover of Radio, or the Radio Amateurs magazine. And you can see, we've got Gagarin and Tereshkova there urging us on into the heavens. And we see lots of images across the Soviet Union, beautiful mosaics and things with Gagarin and Tereshkova urging us to go forward into the heavens. Similarly, again, with the planetary exploration program. So when the first Venera and the first Mars programs were launched in the 61 and 62, you've got both the first day covers and the stamps. Again, we see the rockets are still in this weird science fiction form, but they do actually depict their space probes fairly, pretty realistically. And I rather love the fact that they're really big on showing us the trajectories from the Earth to, in this case, Venus. And we see similar ones for Mars as well. So, we're still getting this propaganda imagery appearing. There's a rather nice pictorial postmark saying, Mars 1. Pardon me. But again, something that's a lot more realistic than we see and toned down compared to the human spaceflight probes. Stamps. The interesting one here I love is See, it's telling us that it was 106 kilometers out in space on the way to Mars. What they don't tell us is the fact that they lost contact with it at that point. So they never knew if it actually got to Mars. They knew it flew past Mars, but it wasn't sending back any data. So again, they'd always put this really great spin on it to make it sound like it was a really successful mission, just telling you that it didn't actually do anything beyond that point. Lunar 9, we see here that first successful landing on the lunar surface. This one I think is particularly interesting. This is for Zond 5 and then Zond 7. And these were what were intended as precursors for the Soviet, the Soyuz missions that were intended to go around the moon. And I love the fact this mission was just after Apollo 11. And they've deliberately used one of the pictures that it sent back of the Earth as it was approaching, coming back to the Earth. And it's not dissimilar to one that was taken from Apollo 11. So they're more or less trying to say that, look, you know, we didn't have to send a man to the moon or two men to the moon to get these pictures of the Earth, because we were able to do that with an automated spacecraft. So it's actually the start of when the Russians were pulling back from claiming that they were ever racing to the moon with the Americans. Now, we do know now, of course, that they were racing hammer and tongs all the way to the moon, right till the sort of the last second when Apollo 11 achieved that first landing. And then they began to backpedal very quickly, saying, oh, no, we were never racing the Americans to the moon. And this is an early start of that kind of approach. So, you know, we can still get pictures of the Earth without having to risk the lives of humans. The American approach, again, to deep space exploration was a lot more laid back. About the only early recognition I could find in a time cover was for Mariner 4, which of course sent back the first images of the Martian surface, and a focus on Bill Pickering, who was the head of JPL at the time. But the US didn't actually issue its first stamps commemorating any planetary exploration until the 70s. And then we see one for Pioneer Jupiter, with the Pioneer Jupiter missions, and the Mariner 10 missions to Venus and Mercury. And again, very simple designs, more or less just saying, you know, we've got a spacecraft going to Jupiter, we've got a spacecraft that's going to go to Venus and Mercury, or that's been to Venus and Mercury. So they're this really laid back, we said we were going to do it and we did it kind of approach. How are we going for time, Wayne?
You're 65 minutes in. I think you're okay for talking a bit longer, Kerrie.
All right. I'll whip through a lot. I'll whip through a lot more of this, because
I reckon another 30
a lot of it
minutes.
is.
I think people would still be happy if you went another 30, but if you don't, you don't have that content, no problem. But don't.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to get a feel. This is an interesting choice, though. The next chronologically sequential stamp that the Americans issued on the space side was actually one for Robert Goddard. Now, Goddard, of course, was the first person to fly a liquid fuel rocket back in 1926. He was one of the pioneers of rocketry in the United States, but he died in 1945. And he died pretty much largely unrecognized at the time, and right up until the 60s, when the United States government, with prodding from various people, finally sort of recognized the fact that Goddard, you know, a lot of Goddard's inventions, a lot of his patents really lay at the heart of the American space program, particularly things like the Atlas missile. And so they recognized that and actually paid his widow, Esther, patent fees, patent royalties for utilizing all of his patents in the US space program. And then he became a lot better known. And at that point, they decided to issue this stamp commemorating Goddard, trying to get him up, in a sense, on a footing with Tsiolkovsky, who, of course, the Russians were promoting heavily as their early pioneer of rocketry. So it's quite interesting to see that they picked on doing that. And again, we see these, you know, first day covers that are, again, this quite restrained but honouring Robert Goddard in this case as that pioneer of spaceflight, although of course they refer to him as the world's first space pioneer, which is not exactly correct, certainly not from the Russian perspective. But Goddard continued to be recognised as this father of spaceflight in the US, and I thought I'd throw this one in, which is actually an Apollo-Soyuz era cover, beautiful silk cover, which was something that became very popular in the US in the latter part of the 60s and into the 70s, showing his original liquid fuel rocket there. Some of you may even remember the fact that I had a full-scale model of this at the space exhibition in the Powerhouse Museum. When the America was starting to move to the Gemini program, the Soviet Union was actually starting to work on its lunar program, Soyuz, but they didn't want effectively to be beaten by the United States to a space first. And so Gemini was going to have 2 people on board. The Russians decided, we'll do better than that. We'll launch a spacecraft with 3. So essentially what they did was to strip out pretty much everything inside of a Vostok, which is a 1-person spacecraft, and put 3 couches in it and put 3 cosmonauts in it. It was so tight in there, these guys couldn't even wear spacesuits. Although the implication, we see the 3 crew there in their flight suits, and the implication was that this is safe enough, we don't need to wear spacesuits. In fact, it was because it was so damned unsafe, we didn't have enough room for them to wear spacesuits. It was a very, very risky mission. These guys are absolute heroes. They did risk their lives on that flight. Komarov, of course, would later die in the Soyuz 1 crash. But the particularly interesting thing with this is how simple these stamps are in the first day covers compared to all the early ones we've seen, because the Russians didn't want us to know that this was not a new spacecraft. They changed the name to Voshkod, but it was actually a Vostok with most of the bits ripped out. So then they didn't want it. They literally didn't want us to know that. So there are almost no pictures of the spacecraft, very little imagery relating to it. In fact, I love the fact that they use these great little science fiction illustrations of future spaceflight rather than anything that depicted the actual spacecraft. We see that again with Voshkod 2, which of course was when Leonov made the first space flight. The only images we see of it are this totally unreal depiction of this thing that looks like a giant pill that has, a very, 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 very vague resemblance to the rough shape of a Vostok spacecraft, and that's about all you can say about it. But they, so they were very much trying to not show the spacecraft, but at the same time imply that it was a new vehicle. We've got they've got Leonov, of course, and this is rather interesting. If you've seen the actual way that Leonov, they actually had like a blow-up airlock that Leonov used to actually leave the spacecraft and make his spacewalk. And in fact, he nearly died because he had trouble getting back in. His spacesuit ballooned that much, he had trouble getting back inside this blow-up airlock. But of course, they're depicting it here a bit like the way they did it in Gemini, where both astronauts would be in their spacesuits, they'd open the hatch to raw space, and one of these astronauts would make a spacewalk. So this is actually depicted more like a Gemini spacewalk than the way that it was actually undertaken. So I find that interesting as well. And here again, Time sort of wanted to cover it, but they didn't have much they could actually use to cover it with as their cover image. So you've got one of these grainy shots of film that was actually taken from Voshkod 2 while he was spacewalking. And again, because the Russians just literally didn't want to show anything that would indicate what the Vostok was really, or the Voshkod was really like. The Gemini, again, which of course was the interim program between Mercury and Apollo, where the Americans tested out all the techniques they would need for the lunar program. This is a rather nice 1967 stamp, obviously showing the first American spacewalk and symbolizing space achievements up to that point. I threw this in because this is actually, Paul Cowell was the artist who did this design, and this was an envelope he made for his family that shows like the stamp, but then he did a drawing on it, an actual illustration similar to what he used as the basis for the stamp. So I just thought that was rather nice, showing his own artwork alongside the stamp drawn from his artwork. But Time magazine, of course, promoted the Gemini program through like Flight Director, which is really interesting that they actually gave us some information about the people behind the scenes. We never heard about that from the Soviet Union. The only thing we ever heard about effectively were the cosmonauts, and only then after they'd made a flight. And this is particularly interesting where they've actually depicted the Gemini rendezvous sequences for Gemini, what was that, 6-7, the first dual spacecraft actually rendezvousing, as distinct from just being in space at the same time, which is what the Russians did with Vostok 3-4 and 5-6. So again, you know, no huge propaganda in the sense of flag waving and all the rest of it, but just saying, you know, these are the people getting the job done, and this is how they did something that was in fact a world first. And this is the point where America is starting to actually surpass the Soviet Union with ongoing experience in spacewalking, a lot of other new techniques, rendezvous and docking, that they're experimenting with and proving that they could do it. So you get these rather nice United States space achievement covers, as well as these simpler Gemini covers, which are more or less just telling us what's going to happen on each particular mission and who the astronauts are. And I rather like this one because it not only looks at the first spacewalk, it's also showing the first American soft landing on the moon with Surveyor 1. And then this one, which of course looks forward to the Apollo program at that point. So they're sort of saying, you know, what we've already done, and this is what we're going to do. Interesting too, I mean, a lot of the covers that we see from the Soviet Union were, of course, produced by the Soviet Post Office, whereas the American ones were, you know, sort of 90% or more publicly produced by different commercial companies or stamp clubs, like the literally Johnson Space Center stamp club that would commission printers to make, or, you know, somebody to design and then produce the first day covers. So again, a different approach in how they were done, which is another reason why you don't get a lot of that political bombast that you see in the Soviet covers. Now I'll just whip quickly through some of this, just again to show you the next space stamp that the Americans produced was for Apollo 8, which of course gave us that incredible reading on Christmas Day, the book from the Book of Genesis. And of course, they very deliberately took those opening words, you know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this was a very deliberate stab at the Soviet Union being an atheist country. But, you know, the God-fearing United States attributes at least part of its success to the fact that it believes in God. So very, very much tying into being the opposite of the Soviet Union. As you can see, you're getting a, you know, Apollo 7, Apollo 8, these are a couple of different contrasting types of covers. In fact, this is probably one of the first ones where you're actually seeing a bit of stars and stripes here in the Apollo 7 there. If you look, you can see a little bit of an allegory of the stars and stripes there. Time, of course, and life are picking up on the race heating up in 68. This is a cover from just before Apollo 8 was launched, when they thought that the Russians might actually be trying to get a circumlunar mission at the same time. The Apollo 8 crew were actually declared the Men of the Year for 68. One of the things I love, there was an anonymous letter to the astronauts after 1968 was considered one of the worst years in the latter part of the 20th century, particularly in the 60s. So many, you know, a lot of civic strife and that in the United States, the Vietnam War and so on. And it was often, you know, this letter came and said to, thank you, Apollo 8, you saved 1968. And this was very much a feeling that people had in the United States. And so Life sort of picked that image of the Earth from Apollo 8 to say that, you know, this wonderful year that ultimately was pretty bad in many ways, but Apollo 8 made it a really special year. So you can see Life was sort of, again, taking these simple approaches, but, you know, here's Apollo 9, the daring contraption called the LEM, and so forth. Of course, when we come to Apollo 11 itself, the actual moon landing, you know, here we've got this first man on the moon stamp. Very simple, but it says absolutely, you know, America has done this. We have landed on the moon. It doesn't have to say rub your nose in that Soviet Union. In the same way, it just makes the statement. And interestingly, Aldrin's father, who I don't know if many of you know, was actually a general. He was quite upset about the fact that his son wasn't getting what he thought was due recognition. And he actually mounted a campaign to have this say first men on the moon. And apparently Aldrin was somewhat embarrassed by all of this. He felt that his father was, you know, carrying the whole thing too far. But ultimately, General Aldrin didn't change the post office's opinion, and it came out with the first man on the moon caption. But and interestingly too, if you look at the time cover, so again, very simple. What does it say? Man on the moon. But we actually see, this is one of the few times we see an American flag actually being part of the imagery. And of course, what it's saying is this is an American triumph. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it, Russia. Is more or less what they're saying here. I've often found this rather interesting. I mean, this is, you know, you see there on Armstrong's chest, he's got the camera, and he's holding it in exactly the way that you would to operate it. But I've always thought it also looked like he was holding a gun. And I've often wondered if this was a bit like that Soviet poster that said, you know, we're not only got rockets, we've got big missiles. But this one is saying, we've come to the moon for peaceful purposes, but we'll fight if we have to. You know, I may be reading too much into it, but it's always struck me in that way. As I said, maybe I'm reading too much into it. But again, even with this, you know, this wonderful achievement, first landing on the moon, the covers are still relatively restrained. This one I love because it reproduces the plaque that was on the lunar module, which of course, you know, has the "we came in peace for all mankind," which is of course a propaganda statement in itself, again, turning back that peace rhetoric that the Russians have been going on with all the way through. But this very, you know, very restrained, man's first landing on the moon, we did it sort of thing. I'll just quickly whip through these. These are just examples of the different covers and stamps that the Soviet Union released for their later or for the next batch of Soyuz missions. So we've got Soyuz 3, Soyuz 4-5, which of course was the first manned linkage of two spacecraft in well, ever, because Apollo 9 didn't occur until a couple of months after this. And again, the Soviets actually whipped that up quickly to make that happen before Apollo 9 so they could one up the Americans again. There was a lot of this, we'll try and get something done before the Americans so that we can deliberately beat them to it. So on with you know, Apollo Soyuz 6, 7, 8, where you had the triple mission. We see them here. Soyuz 9, which was a long duration mission. Soyuz 10, which was actually the first flight to the Salyut 1 space station, which unfortunately they weren't able to dock. And when the first mission did dock with Salyut 1, very sadly, this is the Soyuz 11 crew. They were found dead when they returned to Earth because of a valve that had been jarred loose in their spacecraft, and the atmosphere actually had seeped away. And they were actually traveling the Soyuz, even though it was a 3-man spacecraft, was pretty tight. And again, they were not wearing spacesuits. They were only wearing flight suits. And so, of course, when the atmosphere dribbled away slowly enough so that they didn't initially notice, but of course they didn't have spacesuits as a backup, so they suffocated. And then, of course, the Russians actually, and this was the first time they issued a stamp commemorating cosmonauts lost in space. So there was no stamp commemorating Komarov, for example, because they wouldn't admit, well, I mean, they had to admit that he was killed, but they didn't want, at that time in 67, they didn't want to commemorate it with a stamp, whereas by this time attitudes generally had changed enough that they did commemorate the loss of the 3 cosmonauts. And across, because I'm taking this up to sort of 75, by 75 you have the Salyut 4 space station, and they were regularly issuing stamps for each of the crews that would travel to Soyuz 4. So that was interesting in itself, that you get this steady issue of stamps now telling us who the crew were and the fact they were going to this particular space station, even though it didn't tell you what they were doing on the space station. So this is sort of up to the time that we get to the Apollo Soyuz itself. Very similarly with the United States, there were no additional stamps issued during the Apollo missions, but each mission, of course, had its own sets of covers. In fact, the ones I'm showing you here are just examples of dozens of different kinds of covers that were issued for each of these missions. And if you go online and search, you'll see, you know, a whole lot that were issued for each mission, lots of different designs from different stamp dealers or stamp clubs, philatelic groups, things like that. Again, time as the equivalent of the propaganda poster. We see the for Apollo 11, I'm sorry, Apollo 13, you know, the fact that these guys were rescued, very simple, they came back alive. This one is again interesting for the return, where they've chosen to show the astronauts praying. So again, they're showing not only their relief, but the fact that Americans are not godless commies. So again, you know, there's an underlying propaganda message there, but it's not that in your face kind of thing. At the time of Apollo 15, or just after Apollo 15, they issued the Decade of Achievement stamp, so 1961 to 1971. This included some envelopes that were actually, or some covers that were actually stamped on the moon. You might just be able to see that. It actually sort of says, you know, on the moon. The US Post Office issued an official die that the crew carried. They not only, of course, stamped a number of official envelopes that went back to the United States Post Office, but what got the Apollo 15 crew into trouble was that they also stamped a number of covers that they brought themselves, that they had done a deal with a big philatelic dealer in the US to stamp them on the moon, sign them on the moon, and then they would be sold to raise money for the astronauts' families should anything happen to them. So they refer to them as insurance covers. But these particular ones, and some of the earlier astronauts had signed covers as these insurance covers before, but these guys were just a little bit too commercially minded, and NASA wasn't very happy about that. And so it actually cost the Apollo 15 crew the possibility of making any further space flights. They were all classed as being very naughty boys, and there was quite a kerfuffle about it afterwards. But the stamp issue itself, again, it's another one of these simple, straightforward designs. You know, we've landed on the moon, now we've got a car, we're driving on the moon as well. You know, these are our space achievements from the first American astronaut to the moon landing. So again, these very simple designs, straightforward ones. A couple of designs for Apollo 16 and 17. I find this one really interesting because these envelopes were actually made from the maps that were used, or copies of the maps that were used to plot out where the astronauts were going to land on the lunar surface. And you actually see things like that quite a bit in the shuttle program, where they've taken the orbital maps for the shuttle and reproduced them as covers for each particular mission. And in fact, it's only with Apollo 16 and 17 that you really see these kinds of overt American symbols again. So, you know, the shield in the colors of the American flag, and of course the American eagle here for Apollo 17. The Skylab mission, of course, the single space station, but 3 different crews. So again, you had a number of different covers for them. Mostly that same kind of straightforward type that essentially was showing the crew, saying a bit about what they were doing during the mission. And there were a lot issued for Skylab because the missions went on for increasingly long periods of time. So they would be issued every so often to sort of talk about what the astronauts were doing at different times. Actually, I thought I'd throw this in. This is quite interesting. The Westar satellite launched in 1974, the US Postal Service introduced a mailgram, so telegrams that could be sent via satellite. And Western Union issued the world's first satellite mailgram. So you could actually go to a Western Union office and deliberately send your telegram via satellite. And they would come in these special envelopes or covers. So that was in 74. Also, this was interesting around the same time. The Soviet Union had introduced a program called Intercosmos, which was designed to be primarily a cooperative program with different socialist countries to enable them to get satellites into space or put instruments onto Soviet satellites. But in 75, so this is in the lead up more or less to Apollo Soyuz, they actually did a program with France. This was the ARAX program. That's saying experiment ARAX there. And so they wanted to sort of praise show the fact that, we're not just cooperating with the United States, we're opening up, we're cooperating with the West. And here, this is a cover particularly marking that. So we've got the Soviet and French flags and the symbol of this particular auroral research mission. So, it's almost harking back to some of the early propaganda covers, but this time convincing us that they actually want to be open to the West, or they're cooperating with the West, which of course brings us finally to Apollo Soyuz, where we had everything in Apollo Soyuz was joint. This was going to be a mission where for the very first time we'd have the Soviet Union and the United States docking together in space. So all kinds of things were produced around this mission that were joint. In the collection at the Powerhouse, I actually had a EPAS Cologne. EPAS is the acronym from the Soviet language, for the Russian language for Apollo Soyuz test project. And the Cologne itself was produced in Russia, but the packaging and everything and the distribution in the West was handled by Revlon. So you had this joint Russian Revlon perfume that was issued. There's a whole range of other things that were done in the same way, kinds of souvenirs. And so we had these joint stamps. So this is the American versions, or the English language versions of the joint stamp, where the artwork for this one was done by a Soviet artist, and the artwork for this one was done by Bob McCall, very famous American space artist. Similarly, you've got commemoratives like this one, where you've got one of the Soviet stamps on this side with the Soviet pictorial space postmark, and then over here you've got the American stamp and the American postmark for the link up as well, and then this little central sterling silver coin. And you can see, of course, everything's in English and Russian. You see that, so that's the English version of the stamp. You see the Russian version of the same stamp here with the text in Russian compared to the English. In fact, this was the whole set that the the Russians produced it had a couple of extra ones with the entire Apollo-Soyuz cruise, and then the launch of the Soyuz as well from the Soviet Union. And just finally, some of the covers that were produced, a lot of them again were joint, so that you would have a cover with an English language version and then an almost identical one with Russian text on it. And then some that were just specifically produced either in the Soviet Union or in the United States. And this rather nice large format label type that has both a Soviet stamp, but also this additional imagery around it depicting the cruise. So we've gone from, if you like, incredible propaganda on the part of the Russians to a much more simplified presentation, more like the Western style of showing that, we're now working together with the West. We don't need to go on with a lot of that bombastic propaganda that we used to in the past. Whereas the West, of course, had the very much that approach of always depicting the quiet achievers. America was just getting the job done without going on with a whole lot of bombastic propaganda. So, and that was supposed to be then, or that represented the contrast as the West saw it between the Soviet system and the, Western democratic system. So there we go. Hope you found that interesting.
Thank you very much, Kerrie. It was fascinating in terms of the scope of number of years. I think it was around about 20 years plus the precursor as well. So covered a fair bit.
I wanted to get some of that precursor stuff in just to show, where all the linkages were.
Oh no, that's fascinating with the business about Goddard and Tsiolkovsky. Of course, the Russians would keep talking about Tsiolkovsky all the time, but as you said, Goddard was probably a little bit underreported, or rather ignored until
he
later.
He was very much really until the sort of mid-60s there. He really, because he'd passed away, just at the end of the war there, before the missile technologies in the US really took off. Pardon the pun. He was, he was kind of, his achievements at that time were sort of pretty much lost, especially when, you had all the Peenemünde Germans come in and they got a lot of publicity. They obviously dominated the development of missiles in the US through the 50s and that. So Goddard's more modest achievements were kind of lost, even though, as I said, he actually had hundreds of, I forget how many hundred patents he had for different, technologies, valves, all kinds of things related to rockets that were being used in the US space program. So it was actually good that they recognized that and paid his widow those patent royalties, because that actually enabled her to live reasonably comfortably actually for the rest of her life. And people don't realize she was actually quite an important part of his work, in that she actually used to record all his notes during their during their test launches. She actually used to operate the use the film cameras and that took a lot of the footage of the launches and that sort of thing. So she was a sort of integral support worker to the a lot of what he was doing.
Thank you very much. Now we're actually after 9 o'clock, so probably limit to 3 or 4 questions, and then we can probably cover a couple of other things I've got to deal with. Okay, so somebody want to
actually, just before you do that, I will put in a merciless plug for an event we have at the Australian Space Discovery Centre on Friday. If you're interested, we've got a YURIS quiz, a YURIS night space quiz, which will be occurring, actually, I think it'll be 3:30 New South Wales time, from 3:30 till 4:30. So if you'd like to be part of it, you can go to the Australian Space Discovery Centre website and register. It'll be online, so you can register for the link and take part if you'd like to.
So just Google the what Kerry's just said later, and you'll be able to enter it. Lou, you put your hand up to ask a question.
Kerrie, if it's not giving away trade secrets, how did you source all your material, all those stamps and postcards? It's
We
just
love the internet, love. It's really a matter of being prepared to search. I mean, some of the material I've actually had that I've acquired for like previous talks that I've done, things like that. And thankfully there is so much more now, especially a lot of the early Soviet stuff that's available on the internet. Just takes a bit of searching, a bit of, you know, understanding where you're likely to find Soviet sources. But yes, it actually took me about 2 days to put that together.
Yeah, that's all right. Goodness.
But,
Thank you.
The whole space program. If you think looking at the space race, you've pretty much covered everything in that 20-year period. The most important part where, I mean, things did change a lot after 75 in terms of the Russian activities. So that's really the space race, the serious ones that people will cover in that period you've done.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to look at. And they're the best examples to show you how you have that contrast between, you know, and particularly in the early days, that incredible propaganda overload from in the stamps and the covers and everything in the USSR, compared to, you know, there was a certain amount of almost embarrassment, if you like, on the US side, that we weren't first, so we won't issue a stamp or whatever, because what's the point of saying we come second? We'll wait till we do something first, or something that's really an achievement, and then we'll be a complete contrast to, you know, the way the Soviets go on. We'll just show what we're doing and show openly that we're achieving things.
Later on, of course, it all changed. So that was the key thing to note. But the actual content of it, what it's covering, yeah, they're quite different. And it looked like first day covers were very important to the US by the look of it. They didn't have as many stamps, but they had a lot of
first day covers were the big thing in the US. That, and as I said, you know, things like the covers of Time and Life were the places where, you know, NASA got its publicity, in a sense. Where you know, where the space program was sort of played out for the American public, rather than, you know, that kind of propaganda poster approach that was very big in the USSR. Of course, the difference there too, you know, most people didn't have television. They only had radios. You know, almost everybody had a radio, but not that many people initially had television. So they didn't get the TV news in the same way. They were getting their information from magazines, the newspapers, and of course from the posters.
Just a comment on the Apollo 15's business too, with that private dealer. That certainly did cause, as you suggested, it basically wrecked the crew's careers. They were not going to get another flight after that, apparently, after they found
Yeah,
out.
no, that's right. They unfortunately did their dash.
Which a couple of them were rather bitter about. I think Dave Scott was certainly over it, but they did cause their own problems, really.
Yeah, well, that was the unfortunate thing. I mean, NASA very much had to be seen to be doing the right thing and not squandering the taxpayers' dollar, because a lot of taxpayers thought they were squandering money anyway, just in the whole moon program. So they really didn't want the astronauts to be seen as making money on the side or anything like that.
That's how it looked, unfortunately, with that business. And that was
yeah. You know, it really looked like these guys were doing what we'd call the side hustle today, in a way that was taking advantage of their utterly privileged positions, because nobody else could do that and make money out of it, you know, except another Apollo crew. So yeah, the NASA did come down on them like a ton of bricks.
Yeah, that's right. Anybody else got any questions to ask? What it means is you covered so much material so well, Kerrie, that everybody knows that they can't probably think of anything else they want to ask. It's probably true, actually, which is pretty much a reflection of how great your talk was.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. You know, it's an area that I love talking about. I could actually go on and on. There's loads more specific stamps I could talk about, the, you know, the imagery on them and everything. But it's just, to me, it's just a really fascinating topic. And then when you link those, oh, actually, I was going to show you my couple of my little Soviet goodies here. I don't know if you can see this.
Oh, but yeah, you're holding something up at the moment. I can see
Yeah,
some.
I'm just trying to
Yeah, it's got to get it
my
right.
image on screen. It's a little bit hard to really see it because the light's reflecting off it. Ah, there we go. But that's one of those little Soviet rockets trailing the word Mir. So it's a Vostok rocket. It's a Gagarin piece on a you know, on a little pedestal here representing the Earth.
Actually,
And it's almost identical to, you know, those rockets that you're seeing in the stamps. And this one here, again, I don't know how well this will show up.
if you take it out of present mode, we'll actually see your screen better.
Yeah,
sorry
I
to
might do.
scroll.
Yes, I'll stop sharing.
So what's happening is at the moment, as soon as you, yeah, that's right. So it'll actually, it'll blow it up a bit better. Sorry, I just realized that after.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
okay.
I
It's out
don't
of
know.
focus. It's held it back a little bit further.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the right place to go.
It's in focus now.
Yeah.
Was in
Trouble
focus,
is
it's gone
the
out.
camera tends to drop in and out of focus a bit with it because it's getting reflection off the.
Just saw it in focus a minute ago. And
Yeah, it was briefly. Actually, it's.
so there's our
There you go. Now you can see there, that's Gagarin and the rocket, which is
Yes.
that same image that comes off one of those 4 stamps.
Yeah, it looks the same. It's the same
Yeah,
image.
it's the exact same image. So, and this is actually, I love this. This is a, it's, if I can get it to come up, it's actually like it's a Russian cigarette case.
Oh, okay.
I love it. But it's what it does is that it shows you how they permeated those images through a whole lot of other things. So it wasn't just they were on the stamps and the postcards and the first day covers. They were on, you know, little trinkets that you could buy, little souvenirs you could buy to take home. They were on matchbooks, matchbox covers. I could almost do another lecture on Soviet matchbox covers.
Well, that's possibly a topic for another year.
Yeah. Well, actually, maybe next year I'll do the matchbox covers for
cool.
Australia and the Soviet Union.
Yep, that's excellent.
But yeah, so you know, but they literally were through all these other things as well. So you know, you've got this constantly reinforcing idea that, you know, the Soviet system can produce this fantastic technology, and you know, because we've got the best technology, we obviously have the best political system. There is something I did want to mention. I thought I'd leave it till afterwards in case we didn't have time. But a lot of those images you see, you know, of the you know, the worker there holding up the image, and you know, the muscly cosmonaut, and you know, hand flung out to the heavens. These are very much examples of what's also referred to as cultural dynamism. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this this aspect of social and cultural studies, but generally speaking, we refer to societies as either being culturally dynamic or culturally static. China is actually a really good example of a culturally dynamic country or nation in the early Middle Ages. So that then became a culturally static nation and lost all the sort of power and influence that it had had. And of course, now it's only like the last, say, 30 years, 30 or so years, we're seeing a new level of cultural dynamism in China. And cultural dynamism is very much focused around a culture that has the ability to adapt and change as new things occur, where there are changes to the environment or changes to technology that may be invented in your country or introduced from somewhere else. And in a lot of ways, the space race was an example of the United States and the Soviet Union both expressing their cultural dynamism. So it wasn't just a political battle. It was a kind of clash of cultural dynamisms. So two countries that have, were very dynamic, both being able to take new technologies and use them and adapt them, and then utilize them in a political sense as well. And so that imagery, I've gone out of the mode, but that imagery in the time cover of the Russian and the American racing to the moon, and you look at the way they're both depicted as these fairly muscular guys running into space. It's very much this, strong, powerful, dynamic symbol. And you see a lot of that in the Soviet imagery, especially, that one I was pointing out with the cosmonaut who's holding the hammer and sickle above his head, huge culturally dynamic symbol. So even beyond the political. So it's really, really interesting sort of additional dimension to the whole thing. But I wasn't sure if I'd have time to go into that in the talk proper.